Hitting record. And yes, so it looks like we are live. Take two. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Awakening Consciousness with Asher and Jesse. Today it's just me, no Jesse today, but I do have a special guest, Morley Robbins. He is the creator of the root cause protocol, also known as the Magnesium Man. He did have a background in mainstream medical, in sort of the mainstream medical field, as a consultant in hospital administration. But then he had an experience that led him to investigate alternative and natural solutions to health, which helped him understand the importance of magnesium. Since then, he developed the root cause protocol and founded the Magnesium Advocacy Group. And then his most recent book, The Cure, which we'll be talking about today, is about helping people suffering from persistent fatigue by helping to unravel the story between copper, magnesium, iron, and ceruloplasmin. So Morley, welcome to the show and thank you for joining.
You bet. Delighted to be here. And I'm mightily impressed that you can pronounce ceruloplasmin, because most people can't. So you get a gold star for that. And the challenge that I had when I was doing the narration of that book was that word appears about 1,000 times in the book. And after about 500 times, you just start to garble it, and it's impressive. So thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So, and thanks for joining. And maybe if we could start by talking a little bit more about your background. I know it was sort of, mainstream medicine, whatever we want to call that, Western modern medicine, and then how you came into looking for alternative solutions.
Sure. Yeah, I affectionately refer to myself as a pre-med retread. I had designs or desires to go to medical school, but the academic rigor was not my strong suit. So I went to Plan B. And if you can't be a doctor, you become a hospital executive, so you can boss them around. It's the most natural thing to do. So I did that. Went to business school and became a hospital executive. I was never the CEO of the hospital. I was always in charge of strategic planning and marketing, helping to grow the business side of the organization, and did that for 12 years, and then switched into hospital consulting and did that for 20 years. And the run-in with my body was from pulling a suitcase behind my back for 20 years, and I developed what's called frozen shoulder, which got me to my now wife, Dr. Liz, who's a chiropractor, who helped free this frozen joint, and I was able to get my full mobility out after a couple of chiropractic adjustments, and it just woke me up to a whole side of healing that I'd never known about.
Very interesting. And so how did that lead into investigating magnesium and then developing the root cause protocol?
In one of our early conversations, she made a comment about the innate healer, this mechanism inside our body that can heal itself. And I didn't say anything to her at the time, but I thought to myself, if there's an innate healer, why do we have millions of doctors around the world? And so I wanted to go out and begin to research, who is this innate healer? And that really got me to the world of minerals. And my first stop was reading Carolyn Dean's book, The Magnesium Miracle. And I was fascinated by the whole concept of magnesium deficiency and magnesium loss. And over a period of years, it got me to understand that when iron interacts with oxygen, it creates what's called oxidative stress, or we call that rust in the common world. Well, when you have oxidative stress, you lose magnesium. Well, then I wanted to find out, why aren't iron and oxygen playing nice together? And it's from a lack of copper and the copper enzymes. And the most important copper enzyme, or it's actually a copper protein that expresses different enzymes, is called ceruloplasmin. And it's just this powerhouse mechanism that I would argue is the innate healer. It has intelligence, it knows what's going on. And it's absolutely fascinating to think about what its capacity is, but yet it's not openly understood. It's not taught in doctor school. Very, very few practitioners know what ceruloplasmin is. And if they know what copper is, they just know it's toxic. And that's just not the case. And that's where a lot of the confusion is.
And is it the case that a lot of people, or a high percentage of people, have too much iron in their diet? Is that partially the cause of this?
Absolutely. No, it's a very important observation, Asher, because what happened that most people don't know about was that in 1941, and this is written up in a wonderful book by Jim Moon in 2008. It's called Iron, the Most Toxic Metal. It's a wonderful paperback. I've read it 5 times because I always get something new out of it. But he was an iron toxicologist, originally from Canada, and then he moved to the States and to Minnesota. But he points out that in 1941, England, Canada, and the US started adding iron filings, not organic iron, iron filings, to the food system as a form of enrichment. And then in 1969, the FDA here in the States wanted to increase the amount of iron threefold. And 20 some scientists, I think it was like 26 scientists from around the world, came to Washington, D.C. to testify and said, what are you trying to do? Kill people? And so the FDA backed off the 300% increase and made it just a 50% increase. But just, there's so much iron in our food. The produce has been hybridized. The seeds have been hybridized. When I was a young guy, I was born in 1952. And back in the day, spinach was a product that had copper in it. Now the spinach in the modern era, it's iron, it's not copper that you're getting from spinach. So they've changed the uptake of these metals dramatically. And it's not just spinach, it's across all spectrum of different produce. And we're just not aware of it. And what people don't realize is that when copper is low in the soil and in the diet, iron's going to rise in the body. And that's really where the real breakdown begins to take place in the body.
And isn't it true that there's in I guess baked products like bread and other things, and they've cereals too, I think they've quote unquote fortify them with iron, and that iron, it's like actual shavings of iron rather than what would normally be taken up by plants in the soil.
Exactly. I mean, there are YouTube videos where people are using magnets to pull their cereal out of the milk. It's like
Wow.
you don't even want to think about it, but that is very commonplace, and it's just a misunderstood aspect of nutrition that not enough people know about. So that's what these conversations are so important for.
Yeah, absolutely. And is this, how does the root cause protocol play into this? Like what is it, and was it developed from this understanding, and from maybe understanding what diseases could be caused by too much iron in the diet?
Yeah, well, the key is a lot of people are familiar with the book, the Merck Manual. That's the text that physicians use to identify different diseases. Well, there are actually 33,000 different conditions outlined in that book. But what a lot of people don't realize is that every condition, syndrome, malady, disease, whatever you want to call it, starts with energy loss. And that's why the title of the book is Cure Your Fatigue. It doesn't matter what the mechanism is. The originating event is a lack of energy. And what's important for people to appreciate is that it's our mitochondria that have a lot of copper in them that allows energy to be produced at optimal levels. Well, if it's not being produced at optimal levels, what happens is iron is going to start to build up in the mitochondria and then in the cell. And then you're going to have a significant loss of energy. And that's when all sorts of dysfunction starts to creep in and the oxidative stress builds. And that's when you get all these different symptoms, whether it would be, atherosclerotic plaque or some neurodegenerative condition or arthritis, or the identification of the quote problem is many steps after the breakdown of energy production. And so what really stimulated the creation of the RCP, the root cause protocol, I was reading a wonderful article by Ray Peat. I love what he has to say about the human body. Don't agree with everything he says, but I think he's just a fountain of knowledge. And it was an article about iron toxicity. And towards the end of the article, he made a very important comment. He said, to my knowledge, no one has ever developed a diet to increase ceruloplasmin in the human body. I thought, well, maybe that's what I can do. And so I was inspired by that sentence and began to set out to do what I called stops and starts. And that was really inspired by my oldest son, Matt, who's an engineer. He said, well, Dad, I think what you need is don't do this and do this. And I just simplified it to stops and starts. And it started out with just a couple things to stop doing and a couple things to start doing. And then over the years, it's grown into a dozen stops and a dozen starts. And then it's laid out in the second half of that book as here's the solution to the problem. So it's a really useful guide for people to get a sense of how to start this process.
Okay. And so what are some of the starts and stops that you talk about in the book?
Well, I think it's going to surprise some of the people who are listening, but again, to be successful in the world of consulting, you have to be a bit of a contrarian. And you have to be able to look at data differently. And so I took a very jaundiced eye to what people were being told to do. And I questioned it and invariably would put it up to a mirror and say, maybe we should be doing the opposite. And it turns out that in the research, and I do a lot of research, I read usually 2 to 3 hours every morning, 7 days a week. And what you find is things like recommendations to take ascorbic acid, vitamin D, zinc, iron supplements, calcium supplements. All those don't do that because they really disrupt the natural mechanism and metabolism of the cell. Well, that's heretical recommendations, and especially in this post-COVID era of ours. And what I found is that those mainstream recommendations by nutritionists and doctors are not founded in the scientific research. There's no basis for it. And the starts are things like you need to get more bee pollen and bioavailable sources of copper, like real vitamin C, which is very different than ascorbic acid, grass-fed beef liver, which is immensely different than grain-fed beef liver, and I'm sure you know that. And so it begins to set up this contrasting set of recommendations that I think catch people by surprise initially, but then as they start to think about it, they realize, yeah, there has been this wholesale change in what we've been told to do or not do. And it's not the whole focal point of the RCP, Asher, is what do we need to do to make copper more bioavailable so we can make more energy, so we can get over that cellular fatigue, that whatever that metabolic breakdown is. We need to make more energy. That's the solution.
Yeah. I listened to someone that I frequently listen to about how one of his main things that he came to in life, and just, he sort of builds systems for running his life. He doesn't necessarily have a goal to lose weight, but if you develop a system where you're exercising every day or you're eating right, then you will by extension lose weight or get fit or something like that. So it's not necessarily I'm going to lose 20 pounds. It's I'm going to develop a system for exercising and eating right, and then as a result, I will lose. I'll achieve my fitness goal or whatever it is.
Exactly.
And one of the things that he talks about is like one of the most important things you can do for your health is to just figure out, by testing what you're doing and what you're eating and everything like that, to how do we get the most energy? Like how do I regulate the most energy? If I don't get a good night's sleep, I'm going to have less energy. If I eat this food and not that food, I'm going to have less energy. And so his without necessarily knowing what causes energy or what causes or the functions of the body that make energy, that's his like sort of system for how he lives his life. And so could you go in a little bit deeper about the body's mechanism for producing energy?
Yeah, no. How much time do we have? No, I'd be happy to do that. No, I think what's important for people to realize is that we are energy and light beings. We need to produce energy. That's why we're here. We're not unlike those beautiful plants in your garden, Asher. And so we may not respond to sunlight the exact same way, but boy, we've got to make that energy. And the average person has 40 quadrillion mitochondria. Well, that's 15 zeros, folks. That's a lot of mitochondria. And we all remember our high school biology textbook that had a picture of a cell and it had the nucleus dominating the center of the picture. Well, it turns out that picture was drawn by Walt Disney. It has nothing to do with reality because it only had 2 or 3 mitochondria in that picture. Well, it turns out the average cell has 500 mitochondria. And the mitochondria are not energy furnaces, they are factories. And think of a car factory. Yes, it's producing energy, but it's doing all sorts of activity to produce some set of products. And so this idea that it's a passive power plant is not accurate. In fact, the leading edge scientists who are studying the mitochondria refer to the mitochondria as biological microchips. Well, now that's a very different image to put in your head about what the mitochondria are. But it gets even more exciting when you begin to study how many mitochondria are in different cells of the body. That the average liver cell has 2,000 mitochondria. The average kidney cell, 4,000 mitochondria. Heart cell, 10,000. The mature egg in a woman's body. This is amazing. It can be as much as 600,000 mitochondria. And then we get to certain brain regions like the substantia nigra, which is very much involved in a condition called Parkinson's. 2 million mitochondria. Now, the part that most people don't know about is that the work of a very famous scientist at Auburn University. His name is Paul Cobain. Brilliant. I'm convinced he'll get a Nobel Prize within his lifetime. He certainly deserves it. But he studied the mitochondria to identify the fact that there's 50,000 atoms of copper in each mitochondria. So here's an example. What is Parkinson's? Well, Parkinson's is when there's actually about 1 million neurons, nerve cells, in the substantia nigra. Each one has 2 million mitochondria, and each of those mitochondria have 50,000 atoms of copper. So the number is ridiculously big, right? And what is Parkinson's? It's when 2/3 of those nerve cells are dead. They're not functioning. Well, that's a tremendous loss of energy and an enormous loss of copper. And when you really get into the literature of neurodegeneration, what you find is that it's the accumulation of iron in the tissue that hoses the copper in the cell and the mitochondria, and then you can't make energy. And it's very well documented. It's just the average person looking on Google or Brave or wherever they might go for their search isn't going to ask the right question to get into the bowels of the real sophisticated research about this.
So in other words, like all the, all the I don't know, energy drinks or what have you, they might produce a temporary source of energy, but it's not getting to the let's say the root cause of your lack of ability to produce energy.
Right. We've all, most of us, I shouldn't say all, but most of us at some point in our life have experienced the behavior altering effect of alcohol. And it's like that, it does have its influence. And there are things like these high energy drinks. They will change in a very acute state the energy level, but there's an enormous crash that's going to follow it. The body's always got to adapt to that. So it's a false high. And what we're trying to get at with the RCP is rebuild the foundation so there's a consistent performance and production of energy.
Okay. So walk us through, how we would start this. Let's say I'm, not the case for me, fortunately, but let's say that you are someone who is, chronic persistent fatigue. What are your steps to start this, and how do you go about figuring out where you're deficient in some things or where you have excess, maybe iron in other cases? How do you start down this process?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The most important thing for people to realize is they're not broken. They may have some label, oh, you're a diabetic, or you've got non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or you have some heart condition or Lyme, or whatever the name may be. All that tells us is that you have metabolic dysfunction, and to recognize that that's at the base of all of these different conditions that people live with. So it's the first thing is to shift your mindset. Is just accept that there is this mechanism, this natural mechanism in our body that really wants to get us back into balance, get us back into homeostasis. And so that's the starting point. Then the most important thing to do next is to begin to work your way down the list of stops. And a lot of people have significant improvement in how they feel just by stopping the mainstream recommendations. And that in and of itself is significant. Part of the challenge, Asher, and I'm sure you bump up against this all the time, is I found that, and I've been doing consulting now, nutritional consulting for about a dozen years, but I find it's easier to get people to change their religion than to change their diet. And that's not an easy thing to get people to stop eating this and start eating that. I'm very quick to introduce people to the Weston A. Price approach, because I think it's the easiest and best researched way to start eating a healthy diet. But it starts with getting the processed foods wherever possible out of the diet, getting these high energy drinks that you're referring to, because a lot of people take them, we know that, and beginning to simplify their diet and get it back into what we would call real food. And what is real food? Well, it's usually locally grown, it's very colorful, and it's seasonal. And it's, we shouldn't be eating avocados year round, flying them in from all parts of the world just because we like avocados. That's not how our ancestors used to eat. So the real starting point, after we've kind of released some of this fear that we might be broken, is focusing on simplifying the diet, getting it to a more natural, a more real diet, and then making sure that the stops that are outlined in the book are being honored, particularly the nutritional stops, the supplemental stops. And there's so many mistakes that have been made over the years. And I think each decision in and of itself, you could almost rationalize. But when you begin to put them all together, it's like, how did anyone think this was possible, that we would improve people's health by adding iron, adding calcium, adding things, this and that? So getting the stops underway. And then what we've done is introduced 3 phases of starts and get people to very gently start to introduce minerals into their diet. Make sure that the water you drink and the water you cook with have minerals in them. Begin to remineralize the adrenals. It's called the adrenal cocktail. Get people to start to introduce minerals so that their adrenal glands can start to think again. And why are they important? Well, a lot of attention is placed on the thyroid, right? That's supposedly the master gland. Well, actually, the thyroid makes one hormone. The adrenals make 50 hormones. Let's start back there. That's pretty important. And what does adrenal mean? It means adrenal. It's on top of the kidneys, and a lot of important decisions get made. And it's the most overlooked detox organ in the body, as you probably know. Everyone focuses on the liver first and foremost, which makes sense. But the kidney is tremendously important. And where is 95% of real vitamin C stored in our body? It's in the adrenal glands. Well, what's special about real vitamin C? Well, it's a 6-part complex, but at the very center of that complex is an enzyme called tyrosinase. Well, tyrosinase is probably one of the most important enzymes on the planet. And what's the food industry fixated on? Tyrosinase inhibitors, because they don't want food spoiling. So everything in food processing is about shelf life. It has nothing to do with human life. And so tyrosinase is just this tireless workhorse that is making sure that not just that our pigment in our eye, pigment in our skin, pigment in our hair is right. It plays a critical role in supporting liver function, all sorts of detox functions. And lo and behold, the thyroid doesn't work right if tyrosinase isn't a part of the action. And again, not a lot of people know that, but the endocrinologists in Europe, they do know that. And it's a very different world when you step out of the States and start to look at physiology from a non-Western perspective and begin to see what the more objective scientists have to say. So it's really getting people to recognize that there are components of our food system that have historically supported our physiology, but in the world of modern food processing, those have been violated left and right. You know that probably better than most people on the planet, given your devotion to growing the right kinds of foods. And so it's just really important for people to realize the power of nutrition, but what drives that nutrition are enzymes. And invariably what's behind most enzymes is the need for energy, and that's usually coming from copper. It's just so central to the mechanism of balance and health.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, because you mentioned vitamin C and ascorbic acid. So ascorbic acid is, I think it's used in a lot of processed foods to preserve them, to keep the shelf life up, like you just mentioned a couple minutes ago, and that is equated with vitamin C. But what's the difference between real vitamin C and ascorbic acid, and why is that not such a good substitute?
Yeah, and this is one of those, like, oh my gosh, how controversial could it possibly get? But the real vitamin C complex has 6 parts. And so it's not unlike the cars we drive. So we drive a car that has an engine, steering wheel, 4 wheels, and a cover. And that's the vitamin C complex. Ascorbic acid is just the cover of the car and no moving parts. It's a very different beast. And the overriding gap that exists in science and medicine is not really understanding the role of copper, especially in its bioavailable forms. And so there's an extensive network. Different authors put different numbers on it. The number that's probably the most accepted is around 30 enzymes. Well, again, it isn't just 30 out of thousands. It's 30 at the top of the pyramid, because these enzymes are instrumental in regulating iron, regulating oxygen, regulating oxidative stress, regulating electron flow. And so they become the backbone, if you will, of the body. And the literature is pretty clear about what the downside is of ascorbic acid. It is known to block the absorption of copper. It is known to increase the absorption of iron. That's not necessarily a good thing. It is known to increase the production of hydrogen peroxide. Again, in small doses, H2O2 is a wonderful signaling molecule. It's very important for our physiology. But when it gets into super high doses, it can be very disruptive. Ascorbic acid is known to disrupt the natural structure of ceruloplasmin. And when that happens, there's this loss of copper out of the ceruloplasmin protein that'll show up in the bloodstream. And that's where people think, oh, you're copper toxic. But they never think to ask, what was in your diet? What was in your supplement routine? What's in your medicine routine that's disrupting that critical copper protein? And then another component that I just learned the other day from a client is that in studies where they've used high doses of ascorbic acid, it has a tremendous capacity to lower the functionality of retinol. Well, most of the world is preoccupied with vitamin D, again, for the understandable reasons. But what people don't know is that retinol is probably more important. Again, we've got D and we've got A. Well, everyone's fixated on D. Well, vitamin A is immensely important. And the reason why it's so critical is everyone keys in on vitamin D's ability to run the immune system. What isn't vitamin D? It's the active form of vitamin D, which requires magnesium in the kidney to make that happen. It requires VDR, vitamin D receptor, very important component. Again, magnesium dependent. And the third part of the triad is called RXR, retinoid X receptor, which is a nuclear receptor, which is amazingly important across many different components of our metabolism. But if active D, VDR, and RXR are not working together, you're not going to have immune regulation. And so there's a lot of confusion about, well, they just assume that the retinol is going to be there. Well, it's in the literature that if there's high doses of vitamin D, it's going to block the absorption of vitamin A. So ascorbic acid has this powerhouse influence over these other mechanisms, and everyone always runs to yeah, but it kills cancer cells. That's the first thing people say. It's actually a good way to kill cancer cells. Well, is that really the object? The question that we should be asking is, there's a difference between cancer and cancer metabolism. We've been trained to fear cancer. I understand that. I've many relatives, including my dad, who died of cancer. But the thing is, it's the cancer metabolism that we need to understand better. And cancer metabolism is anaerobic. Even though oxygen's present, the cancer metabolism is anaerobic. There's only one reason why, because there's no copper to run the aerobic metabolism. And so we go from burning fat and producing 140 units of energy, burning sugar, 36 units of energy. Anaerobic metabolism is fermenting sugars, and we get 2 units of energy. Well, that's cancer metabolism. And people don't realize that, yes, the hydrogen peroxide that's produced by the ascorbic acid will in fact kill that cancer cell. But is that really what we're trying to do? Or are we trying to recover the optimal aerobic metabolism of that cell so it can become return to its normal productive activity? And so the world of oncology is a very Byzantine world where we're taught to despise the cancer cell because we don't understand the cancer cell. And so ascorbic acid is used as a safe alternative when in fact, I don't think it is one because of its impact on so many other fronts in our metabolism.
And you talk about vitamin D and the And I think you refer to it in the book as more of a hormone, and I think that's what I understand it to be, rather than an actual vitamin. And so, could you talk about the difference between like vitamin D supplementation and then the way that we're supposed to get our vitamin D?
Yeah, no, it's and again, Dr. Price, I think he really figured this out. He was, I think, one of the first who really understood uh, the A and D dynamic. I mean, it had been something that had been studied in the 1910s and 20s, and so he was kind of working on the shoulders of the giants. But I think what he recognized is that there's a seasonality to storage D. So what we have to do is kind of tease apart. When people talk about vitamin D, they could be talking about a handful of metabolites. It isn't just one component. It comes in as a precursor, it gets activated, and things like that. That it's important to understand the role that sunlight plays in that process. But we were designed to be in the sun, and the sunlight triggers the mechanism to activate the process to start to synthesize vitamin D. And you're absolutely right. It isn't really a vitamin. It is a hormone. And all hormones come in a storage and active form. 100% of all hormones. And the component that's measured in our blood, where everyone's told they have low vitamin D, the component that they're storing or that they're measuring is the storage form of the hormone. Mm-hmm. That's important. Where is that made? It's made in the liver by an enzyme called 25 hydroxylase. Means a hydroxyl group is being added to the precursor. And that enzyme function requires magnesium to make that enzyme work. Why are people low in vitamin D? Has nothing to do with the vitamin D side. It has to do with, is their liver under stress? Does it have too much iron, as is often the case? And when there's excess iron in the liver, it's going to cause magnesium to go down. So a low vitamin D, a low storage D, is really telling us this individual's under stress, and it's a marker for inflammation. And there's a wonderful article for those who really want to get into the gearhead side of this by Meg Mangin, Mangin, 2014, and she talks about vitamin D and inflammation, and it's a fascinating journey into what's really going on inside our body. So the storage D is very different than the active form. And again, storage is what's measured in the blood. Active status is very rarely ever measured in the blood. But what's important for people to know is that both are important, and the active never changes. It's a very stable, static component of our body. The storage, on the other hand, fluctuates with the seasons. And this is a really important point for people to understand, is that we've been taught that vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin. Well, actually what it is in the concept that retinol, vitamin A, is a light sensor. Vitamin D is a light filter. And what does that filter do? It dampens down the amount of light coming into the system. When is storage D highest? During the summer, when we need to block all of that high intensity light through the summer months. And when is storage D lowest? In the winter, when we need to let in as much light, because it's not as light and bright during the winter months as it is in the summer months. And so the storage D it's actually sunglasses. So you're wearing storage D today, Asher. That's what you're wearing. And people don't realize that the real mechanism for light activation and awareness is actually with retinol. And it's a fascinating area of discovery to learn the dance between the two. We got to have both. And what we were meant to do, to your question, is we were meant to go into the sunlight And there's two things that happen in the sunlight. Sunlight will activate the synthesis of hormone D, but sunlight also activates the breakdown of retinol into what are called retinoids. Those are the components that really pretty much run our body. The retinoids, the nuclear receptors, the retinoic acids, there are 4 of them. Well, those are hormones too, you know, and people don't know the A side, they just know the D side. And the A side is amazing. Pardon the use of the word that begins with an A. But the thing is that people need to understand that there is a need for balance. We need both. And yes, some of us do live in climates that don't have a lot of sunshine. That doesn't mean you start to pop soy-based, fat-soluble supplements. It means you need to be eating foods that historically have been producers of hormone D. Eggs, you know, milk, lard, absolutely, fish, you know, because they're eating the plankton in the sea. And so the rich sources of D come through the diet. We were never designed to be using it as a supplement. And I think it's very, very disruptive. And probably the biggest disruption, at least in the research that I've done, is that high doses of vitamin D supplementation will block the uptake of vitamin A. That's a really big deal. And the 2 authors that have written about that are Mawson, Mawson, 2013, and Conaway, C-O-N-away, 2013. And it's amazing that this is known, that there is a dynamic between the two. And if you have too much of one or the other, it's going to block the uptake of the other. Well, we live in a world now where people are drowning themselves in D supplements, not knowing the impact it's having on retinol. And what really stopped me in my tracks is to discover the research of Dr. Burroughs, who was at the Rockefeller Institute back in the 20s. And he wrote 5 articles. One was in 1925, 4 were in 1926, where he talks about retinol deficiency causing cancer. Not many people know about that. And so it's actually a well-known mechanism that's in the world of oncology. They know about it. And they're now using retinol as an anti-carcinogenic, but it's not mainstream. And the public is not aware of this loss of vitamin A, which obviously Dr. Price knew about. Sally Fallon, she's probably one of the foremost authorities on retinol on the planet. And it's central to an ancestral diet. Again, let's focus on that word ancestral, begins with the letter A. There was a lot of retinol in our ancestors' diet that has been lost to the modern era of food processing. So those are some dynamics that I think are important for people to understand.
Yeah, and I would add to that, like, just the advice that we're given by I guess the mainstream medical world is stay out of the sun. The sun causes cancer. Right. Put on your sunscreen, which has aluminum in it, and and pop vitamin D supplements, and it just couldn't be further from the truth.
No, absolutely. And when I first started challenging the narrative on Facebook 12 years ago, it was a massively disruptive exchange. And basically what we ended up doing was on the magnesium advocacy group, we would not let anyone talk about vitamin D until they posted both their storage and their active levels. And it took about 2 years for it to really sink in. But when people finally got it, it was a very powerful moment when they realized they had massively high amounts of storage D, massively high amounts of active D. And when they brought this to the attention of their doctors, guess what the doctor said? Stop taking that supplement. It was absolutely amazing. So the doctors recognized what the problem was, but what they were failing to do was measure the active side They were just focusing on the storage side. And I think that's where we need to have a greater awareness of both aspects.
And so what are the things that we should be doing to, maintain the proper levels of vitamin D combined with the proper levels of vitamin A?
I think the most important thing, Asher, is relax about the D and really put your focus on, am I getting good sources of eggs and butter, lard, as you said, and heavy cream? And are my sources of vitamin A, are they sustainable? Are they valid? Are they natural? And that's what our ancestors relied on. Again, we've been trained in the modern era to think that a synthetic supplement is an easy replacement for what comes by way of nature, by our diet. And my younger son, Tom, very gifted biochemist, got a PhD from Stanford, teaches high school chemistry and happy as a clam. But he'll say, well, Dad, but from a chemical standpoint, they're identical. I said, I get that, but the biology is different. He goes, oh, you got me there. Okay. Yeah. So the thing is, people don't know that the biology is different. And it's important to, again, go back to the basics, make sure it's real food, make sure it's seasonal, make sure it's local, and you're going to have a much better outcome because the body's going to recognize that food. I mean, and this is what like Kate Shanahan talks about in her book, Deep Nutrition. The genetic code that we run on recognizes food because food is the code. And so the more real, the more natural the code is, the more we can have the optimal expression of our genes.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, my dad has given this example of like, okay, so let's say you take every element that is in a carrot and then, so you have your beta carotene and your, your vitamin C and your this and that, and then you put it on the table. Do you have a carrot? No, you don't have a carrot. So what's missing?
That's a wonderful analogy. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the one that I like to use, let's stay with the food theme, but let's go into the kitchen. So we all live in homes with kitchens, at least I think most of us do. And there are a lot of appliances in the kitchen that have steel. And what is steel? Steel is made of iron. So we have refrigerators, we have stoves, we have microwaves, we have mixers, things like that. So think of the kitchen as the mitochondria. And there's a lot of iron in the mitochondria. That's a fact. But does the stove turn itself on? Does the stove know what food to put in the pot? How much water to put in? What's the right temperature? How long to cook it? No, there's always a cook or a cuisine artist, as I call them, because that way we can spell it with CU. We see the symbol for copper. Right. But the kitchen needs a cook. And guess what? The mitochondria, which is the kitchen of our cells, it needs a cook as well. And that cook, that cuisine artist, is always copper, and it's the brains of the outfit. And I think the real intelligence of the body is in the mitochondria, and the nucleus is just a Xerox machine. And how does it get its power? It's plugged into the power supply. So if the power supply isn't right, the Xerox machine is not going to work right. So I think it's a useful analogy for people to think about. Where is the real brains of the outfit? And I think it's in these biological microchips that run on the energy of copper. And you were earlier lamenting, I work, my bandwidth is a function of the copper wire. Well, that's really what runs our body. The electrons flow through copper 3 times faster than it goes through iron. And what I was surprised to learn a couple of years ago is that when the telegraph machine was first invented, the wire was actually an iron wire. And I don't know how they stumbled onto copper as a faster transmission, but suddenly overnight, everything was copper wire. And that's what's run many of our homes. And now we're in this postmodern era where we're using fiber optics, and it's fascinating to think about. But the physiology of our body is designed to run on copper. That's really what the electrons move the fastest through. And that's very well documented in the biological and physics literature studying the metabolism of the cell.
So let's dive in a little bit deeper on copper, because I know you've mentioned it in a bunch of these things, and I haven't probed more deeply into that. But let's talk about copper and its importance, and also where you get this bioavailable copper. What are the sources, and how do we make sure that we're getting enough? And yeah, talk to us about that.
Absolutely. I think what's really important for people to realize is that when you get into the literature of disease, you find out that oxidative stress is the origin of every condition in the Merck manual. Absolutely, 100%. That the oxygen molecule isn't being properly regulated in the mitochondria. And what is that? What does that regulation involve? Well, the oxygen molecule needs to be activated. Well, what does that mean? Well, the oxygen needs to be turned into 2 molecules of water. So O2 needs to become 2H2O. And it turns out that the real engine of the mitochondria is complex 4. It's called cytochrome C oxidase. And that enzyme has copper in it. It turns out, what the literature will tell you is it has 3 atoms of copper, but it turns out that cytochrome C oxidase is a dimer. It means it has a mirror image. So there's actually 6 atoms of copper. So it's a really important part of our physiology. And that part of the mitochondria is sky blue. And why is that important? Because something that has blue, a blue color to it, means it absorbs red light. And that's very important for the function of the mitochondria. Well, those copper atoms are what give that intelligence to that complex. And so that alone would set copper apart from all the other minerals because of its importance to take this poison in our air. 21% of the air we breathe is oxygen. Can't live without it, right? But we can't age without it either. And we need to be able to turn that oxygen into water to release the energy molecules that are modified and enhanced in complex 5. So copper plays this pivotal role in producing and making energy. But what it also does is it clears exhaust. In the process of driving our car, we have the engine is propelling us forward, but there's always exhaust coming out the back end, right? And we have what are called catalytic converters to kind of dampen down that exhaust. Well, guess who's in charge of the catalytic converters inside the cell? It's copper. There's a whole network of copper enzymes: superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione peroxidase, peroxidase. I mean, there's a whole family of enzymes run with a copper battery that lowers the amount of exhaust. When does it become oxidative stress? Well, there's supposed to be this balance between energy and exhaust. And when the energy production begins to fall, exhaust rises. This is the state of oxidative stress. And it occurs when there's insufficient copper to run both sides. But wait, there's more. The third part of copper that very few people know about is that not only is it creating energy, clearing exhaust, it combats enemies. And it runs circles around silver as an antimicrobial agent. When did they first know about this? 8700 BC. Been on the planet a long time. Healers have used it for a very long time. When did everything change? Around the advent of the First World War. I don't know why. I don't begin to understand that side of it. But I was reading a fascinating article this morning about how some bacteria will work with copper, some bacteria are killed by copper. But when you really get into that study, what it was really saying is that copper's critical role inside our body is it was the first antibiotic. Do we need the zithromycin and the moxicillin and doxycycline, or would we be better off having a more healthy diet, a more natural diet, where the body can regulate itself. And that's really the whole basis of the RCP. So then it gets into those three mechanisms: create energy, clear exhaust, combat enemies. That's almost mind-numbing because not a lot of people talk about that. And so it becomes this focal point for homeostasis. And what's important for people to know is that over the last 60 years, there's been an 80% loss of copper in the soil. There's no nutrient that faces greater loss than copper. Is that an accident? I don't know. You begin to start to connect these dots and you begin to wonder. But the important thing for people to know is that a lot of farms are using very strong chemicals, one of them being Roundup. And we know that that's called glyphosate. And a very light bulb moment for me was back in 2018. I was at a meeting and Dr. Stephanie Seneff was sitting across from me at a breakfast roundtable. And she leaned forward and she said, "Morley, would you like to know why glyphosate is so hard on copper metabolism?" "Well, Asher, I thought I had died and gone to heaven." I said, "I can't wait to find out." And it turns out that glyphosate chelates copper down to a pH of 1. What does that mean? It means nothing stops it. And if the soil doesn't have the copper, if the plant doesn't have the copper, if the animal doesn't have the copper, how could the human have the copper? And that's where the real breakdown is taking place. And Dr. Seneff has done amazing studies to be able to connect those dots with these very chronic conditions that people have. What's all copper related? Again, we're back to lack of energy, fatigue. We're back to oxidative stress. We're back to inability to clear the exhaust. And so what we're turning to is it's time to start to restore and resupply the copper. And so wherever possible, again, the three richest food sources that we've identified are the bee pollen, real vitamin C, not ascorbic acid. Good brands would be Innate Response or Pure Synergy, very, very popular. And then grass-fed beef liver. Many people would rather die than eat beef liver, so at least get desiccated. But again, some good brands, Perfect Nutrition, Ancestral Supplements. There are many different brands that you can use. And then out of real frustration, Asher, I decided, you know what, we're just going to make one. And so we developed a product called Recuperate. And it's a play on words, obviously. Yeah, it's a play on words just to get people to recopper their body. And what's in it is desiccated beef liver, spirulina, a dash of turmeric, and copper bisglycinate. And it seems to be helping people really get that essential copper back into their system. And we're just trying to help people again regain the equilibrium that we're supposed to have, because it's what will surprise a lot of the listeners is to find out when COVID was at its peak, I decided to go into the literature to see what's the relationship between copper and the immune system, because no one was talking about it. So I knew it was important. Anytime mainstream's telling you to go left, you got to go right. And so I found 52 articles that clearly identified copper as central to energizing and directing the immune system. Well, nobody talks about that. And it's just, I think the most interesting was an article in 2008 that talked about using copper to kill the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Like, oh, that's a significant piece of literature that no one knows about. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about copper, and all of the medical meme, if there is one, is that you're anemic and you're copper toxic. Well, it turns out it's just the opposite. Most people are swimming in iron because they don't have enough copper in their diet, in large part because of the changes in the farming system and the food processing system have been devastating to copper. And when copper is low, iron rises. When did they first know that? 1928, University of Wisconsin in Madison. Hart, Steenbach, Waddell, and LVM, four very gifted scientists that people should say a prayer to. And then when did they prove it genetically that low copper causes high iron? 2021. And Kim and Gonzalez figured it out, and they studied 10 genes, and the only gene that fired up and increased its expression under copper deficiency was the ferritin light chain gene, which tells the body absorb iron, absorb iron, absorb iron. And that's exactly what Hart et al. Found in 1928, but they didn't have the understanding of genetics back then. But it's what runs our body, is this delicate dance between copper and iron. And here's the nuance that's important. In the world of traditional Chinese medicine, they talk about copper as the general and iron as the foot soldier. Well, you don't have to be in the military to know there's a difference between a general and a foot soldier. And what do we do in the modern era with our science and nutrition? We're shooting generals and we're growing more foot soldiers. Well, that's not a good way to win the war. So I think that's where a lot of confusion is. And what the book is designed to do is begin to tease apart what is the relationship between copper and iron. And it really is, there is no copper metabolism nor iron metabolism. They're actually joined at the hip at ceruloplasmin. And that's what runs our body, is that dynamic interplay between those two key metals and that copper protein. And it's a fascinating area of research that I'm mesmerized by. Can't learn enough about it, and take delight in having conversations like this to share these insights.
Yeah, a lot of great insights here. So where can people get your book?
They can get it on any book platform, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, a lot of different places. They can get ebook if they would prefer, and they can get Audible. Amazon's carrying all the different platforms. The really fun part for me was doing the Audible, and there were people said, "Well, I will only buy your book if you narrate." I'm like, seriously? So I did that, and it was a lot of fun. And what I would encourage people to do is keep an open mind. Read the first half and just reflect on what the last 2 years have taught us, and see how those first few chapters begin to paint a very different picture of what might be the basis of what's playing in the background. And then take a dive into the second half of the book and begin to explore the stops and starts, and just see how they begin to feel. And you made a very important observation, Asher, about the individual who's just saying, how do I feel? Well, we rely on that within the RCP. There's really 5 habits of daily living. Did I wake up refreshed? Did I get a good night's sleep? Do I have an appetite? Am I able to eliminate my waste? Do I have enough energy to get through the day? And is my mood in concert with my situation? If you just won the lottery, you should be excited. If someone in your family dies, you should be sad. And there are people whose wiring gets thrown off. But those 5 habits are really important. And you as a parent know you're monitoring those 5 components day in and day out with your kids. Well, that's what we need to do with ourselves. And if I've got the energy, if I can get through the day, if I can, take in food, eliminate it, that's what we're designed to do. And we don't need to get into the microcircuitry of the, are the venules and the arterioles, are they communicating properly? Are my genes working? It's like, do I just have enough energy? Do I feel refreshed when I wake up? So the book is designed to help people get back to those basics of discernment, to say, I feel pretty good. I'm where I want to be. And that's really what it really comes down to.
Yeah, I think there's the potential for people to overcomplicate things when we're dealing with health, because there's a lot of, there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, stuff going on in the body. But I think if we get back to some core basics of eating right, which, means, a Weston A. Price type diet with, high quality sources of fats and proteins and properly processed grains and legumes and nuts and seeds, and a decent amount of exercise combined with getting in the sun and grounding on the earth and doing some basic things that really improve our health or help our bodies maintain optimal health. But then, it's like, how do you feel? Do you feel like you have enough energy to get through the day? Do you feel refreshed after you've woken up? And there's a tendency to overcomplicate things because it is a complicated there's complicated stuff going on in the body, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be constantly monitoring and checking and all this stuff. So I think it's very interesting to learn about these things and to really get sort of to the root of the issues that you're talking about. And so, sorry.
I was just going to say that I'm not a military guy, but I think mottos can be very powerful. So within the Coast Guard, Semper Paratus, always prepared. Within the Marines, Semper Fi, everybody knows that's always faithful. Well, the motto of the RCP is simplify. And we're just trying to get it down to its basics and help people take back control of just feeling better and being able to be in balance. That's really that's what the whole concept of the root cause protocol is about.
Yeah. Fantastic. So where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
They can certainly join. There's a Facebook group, Magnesium Advocacy Group. There's a Facebook page. It's the RCP page, if you will, root cause protocol page. There's a website, rcp123.org. And I also share my email and phone number just because I know people are always anxious to make contact. My email is just my first and last name at Gmail. My phone number for those brave few, 847-922-8061. And again, you certainly can buy the book, Cure Your Fatigue, and then you can look up Recuperate. So it's just a very forthcoming and simple recipe to trying to bring copper back into the body. So hopefully people will find benefit from that.
Awesome. Well, Morley, thank you for joining me on the show today. It's been very informative. And please look him up, buy the book, and reach out if you are in need of extra support. And so thank you again for joining me. And it was great talking with you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.